Welcome for our session here today. I am just so excited that so many of you have come out to talk about the election last week, what happened, how it went, and where we're going. As those who are in the Rebuilding American Civics program know, and certainly those folks who came with Leader Ethics, this is a bit of a blended program this time, in that we are joined by Lee Rasch, the head of Leader Ethics here in Wisconsin, to talk about this. We thought this was a tremendous opportunity to bring these groups together. Lee will say a couple words here in a little bit about Leader Ethics. And then, of course, we've got Rusty Cunningham, the esteemed former publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cross Tribune and recent inductee into the Wisconsin Broadcasters Hall of Fame. I think you're one of 3 from La Crosse area, right? That's in there. So fantastic. Every time I see Rusty, we always tell him, Rusty, we miss you so much at the La Crosse Tribune. Just a reminder, today this is being recorded. We are recording this session so that we can put it on the Leader Ethics YouTube channel and website so that folks who want to tune in who can't be with us today can join us. And for those of you who don't know, my name is Scinta. I'm the head of the Rebuilding American Civics program. Those of you who are in the civics program know that already, but to those of you I've not met before, it is good to see you. As always, with our Rebuilding American Civics, I always love to call out the D.B. Reinhardt Institute for Ethics and Leadership, who is our partner in this program. Viterbo and the Reinhardt Institute have been so instrumental in making all of this happen and making so many good things happen in our community, so we can't thank them enough. The reason that you got the cards today does have to do with this recording. We want to make sure that those questions are heard, and that's why we're collecting those. We'll see how that goes, and if we have to call an audible, as it were, we will certainly do that as well. Before we start the program today, 2 things I wanted to do. First of all, as I think you all know, today is Veterans Day. Are there any veterans in the audience here today? Okay, could you please stand up? We want to thank you so much for what you've done. We really, really appreciate that service. Thank you so much. And then another group I want to recognize, and we called these folks out actually before the election, but I know that we have several folks who worked at the polls last week. Long hours, a lot of hard work. So where are those folks? Where are our poll workers here? Please stand up. Let's thank them as well. Our elections, as we talked about in the last session, really could not happen without the hard work of all of these volunteers who show up election after election after election to check people in, to make sure everything is going well, to help coordinate. So really, really thank you so much. Today, again, we're going to have a series of questions from Rusty. He has come up with some questions that we'll be going through here. And then, of course, we want to hear from you as well. This is always important that we engage you all in the things that you are interested in as well. But let me go ahead now and introduce Lee Rasch, who can open us up a little bit talking about leader ethics and ethical leadership.
All right, I'll stand temporarily, but we're going to probably keep it conversational here. Thanks for coming out. And if you're not familiar with Leader Ethics is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is committed to promoting ethical leadership among elected officials. Now, we expect ethical leadership in our business leaders, and our educators, and our healthcare leaders. Why not our political leaders? Now, if you want to get a sense of what we're talking about in terms of ethical leadership, we consider these 4 principles as kind of a cornerstone. Ethical leaders are truthful, they're transparent with public information, they're unifiers rather than dividers, and to the best of their ability, they work to represent their entire constituency, not just a simple majority that may vote for them. And that last one is actually vitally important because we're, as a country, we're going to have lots of different opinions on policies and so on, but the fact is, they're all legitimate. And there's always an opportunity to listen to all your constituency, one way or the other. And so those are the things that we're looking at. So today's program is going to be through the lens of ethical leadership. So we're not going to get into our own policy beliefs. For the most part, if it's related to policy, it's really based on electoral reforms that may help us promote ethical leadership, and that's where we're going to focus. So I'm going to sit down and join these guys, and let's get it going.
I'm going to grab a pen so I can take some notes.
And thank you again, both veterans and poll workers, for all of your service. I greatly appreciate it. My father was a radio operator on a submarine in World War II, which I learned as I was growing up, kind of cut down on the whining that he would take from me. So, well, Lee explained what leader ethics is all about, and it's really pretty simple. We do expect ethical leadership, and I think we have a right to deserve that from the people who we elect. So after going through an election, let's talk about what went well and what did not. And I'm not talking about winners and losers. I'm talking about process. Our group is focused a lot on process. Fair, efficient, that's what we focused on. So in that light, Leader Ethics was one of many groups that promoted election integrity and hosted informational forums designed to poke holes in conspiracy theories. First question is, did such efforts work? What else went well this cycle? And there were a variety of pro-democracy groups that were doing a lot of different things during this election campaign. Is there a way that we can get them working together for 2 years from now, 4 years from now? So let's start with what went well.
Well, in looking back at just the elections process, this election process went well. And I'm going to speak primarily from Wisconsin's perspective, but I think we can also look at some things happening nationally. We didn't have the dramatic problems that were apparent or apparently in evidence in 2020. And if you think about it, we didn't have problems in 2022 or 2023 in statewide elections in Wisconsin, and not this year either. Now, there was one issue that was a big issue, but it was human error, and it was in Milwaukee, and at the central counting station, one of the doors that would ideally seal the ballots was left open. But here's what happened that was interesting. There were poll watchers from both parties there, and they observed that, and they agreed with the decision to do the recount. So the process actually worked as it was designed to work. I also predict that we'll have Monday vote counting as something that the legislature will adopt for the next upcoming election. But we recognize that it could take a lot of pressure off the vote counting process if we just take the absentee ballots that come in and allow them to be counted the day before. So I feel that in that regard, the election was well run.
As I mentioned, there were a number of I'll call them good government groups that were working this election cycle to poke holes in conspiracy theories, emphasize that voting is a right and a responsibility. We should feel safe and comfortable doing so. Some of them, though, had different spins on exactly what they wanted to accomplish. Is there any hope that in the coming months, some of those groups, and I know you were tied in with a lot of them, will get together and have this kind of a postmortem and ask the question, should we be working together more effectively for upcoming campaigns?
Okay. Well, one of the things that Leader Ethics has been doing is we've been collaborating with other organizations. You will be amazed to know that there are over 14,000 nonprofits that are working on trying to improve the Democratic Republic in one way or the other. They're across the political spectrum, many of them very small. But it's an interesting thing because it shows there's a lot of citizen concern. That's an interesting thing to see. And by the way, that number has probably doubled in the last decade. So you can see this is an interesting, challenging, and perhaps exciting time that we're going into in terms of our democratic republic. But what we have done is we figured we don't want to compete with other organizations. If they have a different purpose, they're not focusing on ethical leadership, but if they're focusing on something that is a good step toward making elections run better or to help avoid some of the inherent problems we have, then we should be aligning, and perhaps sometimes we share information with them. Perhaps we send them our contacts, they send us their contacts, and we can do a better job in communicating things. And that's just been the approach that we've taken. So we have partnered with an organization called Keep Our Republic, and they basically have been promoting election integrity. In Wisconsin, they've been holding forums around the state. I actually sat in 6 reviews of our elections process, 6 times. And they had people from the WEC there and local clerks, and they were going through the whole process. I still can't tell you I know all the answers if you ask me a question, but I have a lot of confidence in the integrity of the process because of that. But there are other groups that were involved too. There's a group called the WIS Act, which is part of the Carter Center, a national group, and they are just encouraging civility, election integrity and civility. And that's an important aspect of this. You know, sometimes we can get so passionate. We as a group may not act without civility, but there may be people that in our large country that will. And so they're focusing on trying to keep conversations going, keep the temperature down, and try to make sure that we are supporting each other because there'll be another election and there'll be new opportunities, and that's the way our country is working. So I think this collaborative approach makes a lot of sense for us, and that's what we do.
And civility isn't asking too much, is it? We've been able to pull together for public service announcements 2 former governors, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, and they say in a 30-second spot, we don't agree on everything, but we do agree that our elections are fair and that we think you should participate. And I think we're trying to coalesce as much interest from people in saying we can work together, we can be civil. We may not agree on all the fundamentals, but we agree on certain things that are very important, like the importance of voting in an election, making sure that it's fair. So we've covered what went right. You mentioned the Milwaukee incident, but what went wrong? Sam, Lee, do you have any notions about what you think went wrong with election-related details?
Well, overall, actually, the process went really, really well, I think, and surprised a lot of folks, because I think there was a lot of angst that things would not go well. But if I look at maybe where some of the challenges were, one of them was we had some polling places shut down because of bomb threats, right? So that you don't want to see that in a free democratic election. One of those happened here in Wisconsin. They happened mostly in the battleground, so-called battleground states. But what was great is in each of those instances, the system recovered pretty quickly. There was an identification that there was a problem. There was a recognition that it was a false threat, that I think in all the cases it was coming from places outside of the United States that were trying to be disruptive to our process. But the system recovered rather quickly. Judges were on hold to extend hours where it was necessary to do so at polling places. So we made sure that despite the attempt to be disruptive, that we allowed for this process to go still smoothly, that we allowed for these free democratic elections still to proceed without interference, which I think is a great show of resilience for our system, because again, this was one of the things that had people very concerned going into this election is, well, what happens if nefarious actors, wherever they come from, try to disrupt this process? Are we up to that? and it showed that we actually were well up to it. So it was a nice stress test for that process. So in terms of talking about what went wrong, I don't know that it went wrong as much as it could have gone very wrong if we hadn't thought this through. And I think, again, a lot of credit goes to some of these groups that Lee has talked about. There was so much conversation for the 2 years preceding this election about making sure this process was well run, well managed. We had thought through, we had the imagination to think through all the possible problems, and then when they actually hit, we were able to deal with it.
And part of what you've discussed before is the value of what we will call pre-bunking. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. You know, the research shows that it's very hard to change people's minds after the fact, particularly in politics. Okay, so there's been a number of studies on that. But if you can get information out ahead and you can communicate, instead of trying to debunk the issues, we can pre-bunk them. We can talk about what's out there, what's happening, the way things should go, and get ahead of that. And it's interesting too, because there was a survey of, well, first of all, 1/3 of Wisconsinites, 1/3 had doubts about the 2020 election, okay? And a significant percentage of that 1/3 were in the Republican Party. But there was a survey last spring that asked both parties in Wisconsin, partisans, will your vote count? And the overwhelming majority, over 80%, said, yes, my vote will count. They expected this election, their vote would count. So rather than trying to debunk the things of the past, the idea of getting information out and appealing to that sense is a strategy, and we think it's a better strategy to try to affect. But I want to say something. It's not part of our elections process, but it's a condition where we are right now, where we are so divided. It makes us vulnerable as a nation. When you talked about nefarious actors are trying to divide us, they don't care which party wins or candidate wins, they just want to pull us apart. And if we fall into that, we are contributing to the demise of our democratic republic. And so it's vitally important that we recognize that, and when the opportunities present themselves, that we take steps to try to adjust that or correct that. One of the low points in this election for me was when Mike Gallagher, the congressman from Green Bay, resigned and indicated he wasn't going to run for office. Now, there's an organization called the Common Ground Committee, and what they do is they use an objective criteria to rate how people in Congress and governors work together in a bipartisan way. You know, that unifier thing that we're talking about here, okay? And so they have ratings. Basically, they rate the 435 and all the governors, and you can see how they rank. And of the population of congressmen, Mike Gallagher was number 12. He was number 12. He works with the Democratic Party. He was co-chairing the China Committee. He was doing great things to try to bring people together. He didn't vote to impeach the Secretary of Homeland Security. He received a threat that he was going to be primaried, and later confided that his home in Green Bay was swatted with his family there. And so based on it, he said, I signed up for this kind of stuff, but I didn't sign my family up, and that's why I resigned. So that's a real low point for me, because we need more Mike Gallaghers. And if we don't grow that and build that, it's going to be a challenge. And it's because we're divided. If we do this, we can fall into that trap. We find we're recognizing people who just want to fight instead of the people that are going to try to figure out how to work out these challenging issues that we're facing as a nation. So those are some thoughts I have.
And I would dare say most people want to see their elected representatives working with all sides to find good solutions, as opposed to that being considered a curse that will get you primaried, which is kind of frightening when you think about it.
Oh, and even in an election like this, where, again, the analysis continues, but the margins were not as close as some folks were predicting, and yet it is still remarkably close. We are a fairly evenly divided nation electorally. And so the necessity for being able to work with both sides is essential. It's right there and it's central. The other thing I neglected to mention, but the other thing that has me a little trouble, it didn't necessarily go wrong, but it is, you can see the seeds of it going wrong, is there has been scuttlebutt after the election because of the way folks voted. And because of the way the parties shifted in this election, that people are using the decline in Democratic voters as a conspiracy basis on both sides. You have people on the left articulating that perhaps there were, missing votes. This, the same thing that we hear every time. And then you hear people on the right saying, well, see, this just proves that 2020 was stolen because these voters never really existed. And it's gotten to the point of absurdity with this, because the whole point is you can't just call fraud or bad rules or whatever when your side wins or the other side, you've got to be consistent on this. And the fact that those threads are still out there, luckily marginalized for the most part. There are, Occam's razor works pretty darn well. That if you really dig into the numbers, the explanation is there and it is readily available. It goes to this whole idea of transparency. Our process is remarkably transparent in terms of these issues. So hopefully those things get quelled, but you can see things like this, especially when it's coming from both sides, being a divisive sort of opportunity.
And what's interesting is that no one knew who was going to win until after the polls closed, but while the polls were open, we didn't see violence.
Nope.
We didn't, a couple bomb threats without question that should not have occurred, but we didn't see the sorts of violence or intimidation that had been discussed, and I think that's a healthy sign too.
Yes, and I want to point, this election here was the first time in 56 years that we elected a senator from one party and voted for a president of the other party, okay? And both of those were close. But right now, candidate Hovde is within that margin where he could call for a recount. And it doesn't appear he's going to do that, because Wisconsin's election process has integrity, and so raising money to go through the recount process would probably not be something he would ever think of doing at this point.
And yet our process is transparent enough to allow that. And we really are in Wisconsin the gold standard for how these elections are run. And that process even existing for candidates gives them faith. The thing that's fascinating, and again, there are explanations for these numbers. I raise this not from a conspiracy perspective, but more that if you dig into the numbers, they're both fascinating but also readily explainable, is the difference in the presidential election and the Senate election were virtually the same. Close to 30,000 votes for the presidential and for the Senate election, which means there was a 60,000 vote swing in there, basically, to allow for that thing to happen, which I think says a lot about our state as well, that people are not just voting party, again, which goes to something about the whole ethical process. It means people are bringing thought into this process. Now, there are some other factors as well. There were some candidates in the Senate race that drew more votes than the third-party candidates did in the presidential race. But there was still about a 20,000 vote difference there that would not have been accounted for that. So people were voting wisely, voting in a way that was not just strict party line voting.
And you both touched on it, but think about it. We are represented in the U.S. Senate with Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson. Iowa for years, Tom Harkin, Chuck Grassley. Well, are we just schizophrenic? I think people really do value a certain balance. And I think we should pause on that for a moment. Another thing to pause on that Lee mentioned all the election forums he went to, hosted, was part of. Anyone who talks about a centralized election and aren't we consolidating power, does anyone have a guess how many election clerks there are in this state? 1,850. Do you really think you can get 1,850 people together to forge a conspiracy? Much less were we going to lunch today. I do not think so. Lee mentioned bad actors, and I would say foreign and domestic. Let's pause on that a second, because one of our forums a couple of months ago featured cybersecurity expert Miles Taylor. We seem to keep getting interference from foreign entities, often from Russia. How do we stop that? How do we stop nonsense spreading on social media, or can we? And how can you, as a voter, tune out the nonsense and find credible sources of information?
Well, I think there's a bigger picture, and then there's a citizen perspective. And in terms of the larger picture, I know that the Justice Department and other agencies, the FBI, are working very diligently on this issue because it's an ongoing, evolving process. While our speaker, Miles Taylor, was in our program, he said this is a news release here, fresh off the ticket line, and that is that there were 1,000 AI-generated personas on social media, Russians who were actually robots and acting as citizens. Well, can you imagine you're on X or Facebook and somebody puts something out and you just get mad, and so you start responding, and you're responding to a robot. And you get drawn into that thing. And so but basically that's just another evolving thing that's going on. And so there are actually AI-generated defenses now that they're working on, so that you can, in fact, there's a software that we're essentially, if you click on that link that's out there, it'll instantly tell you if this is phony or questionable. And so there's other things that they're doing at the macro level, the large level. But here's the thing, we have to have responsibility as citizens. I mean, if we are taking something that we see on a social media screen, and without thinking, just hitting the share button, we're contributing to something that we have to own that issue. We have a responsibility. And there are fact-checking sources, there are media ranking websites that'll quickly, you can find out if this is an artificially generated story, or it's a divisive thing that's coming from some bad actor somewhere, or if there's something that's newsworthy. But chances are, face it, if it's on social media, what do you accomplish by sharing that? What are you really accomplishing when you do that? If that's affecting your opinion, that's important. It could maybe affect your thoughts when you go to vote the next time. But if you're going to pass some things around on social media, chances are you're contributing to the problem that we have.
Yeah, paraphrasing James Madison in the Federalist paper, you cannot eliminate in a free society information, right? The easiest way to solve is to censor, right? Which none of us want, right? That we live in a free society and we embrace that for a reason, which then underscores what Lee was getting at, the citizen responsibility. And in a republic, citizens have rights and responsibilities. And among those responsibilities is not just to participate, but to participate wisely, to get information, to be a critical thinker when you are entering this process. So it means that we've got work to do. And as citizens, not that, but that we have a need to be thoughtful, not just in whether to share information, but whether to consume information to begin with. This is why we started the Rebuilding American Civics program, right? The whole premise here was to provide a forum for people to come together and use those and exercise those critical thinking muscles in this process. this is what we have to do. And it is hard work. It is not easy work. Democracy and preserving the republic are not easy work. They require we citizens be diligent. It requires that we know how to go out and find the good information. And the good information exists. I talk with so many groups, they say, oh, well, there's so much garbage out there. Yeah, but there's also so much good information out there, and you just have to understand how to parse and to look for it, because it exists. And we can do that, but again, it takes some effort. It takes more than reading something on Facebook or whatever social media feed you want and say, well, that must be the truth, right? It requires something deeper than that, which I know is time consuming, but the republic is kept only by our working hard.
Hemingway had a way of relating to writers. He said every good writer has a built-in, shock-proof, I'll clean it up, BS detector. And I'm looking at smart people in front of me, and you've gone through life successfully by having that little, gee, could this really be true? I'm skeptical, I'm not sure. And yet in this day and age, too often, it's easy to look at something that's shared on social media and say, gee, I wonder if, now, I think the question needs to be, maybe I need to be skeptical of this. Maybe I need to give a second thought when someone says that in a town in Ohio, dogs and cats are being served for dinner. That just on the face of it seems loopy to me, and yet look at the traction that got. I just think as citizens, as voters, we need to be a little bit wary, a little bit skeptical, make sure that, as journalists like to say, consider your source. Mm-hmm. Consider where the information is coming from before you jump to any conclusion.
And to that end, one of the easy ways to do this, one of the baselines, is if you read something and it makes you feel either really, really, really good or really, really, really bad, that's where that spidey sense should kick in. Right? That's where that skepticism should kick in, and you should say, wait a second. If it's making me feel really, really, really good, it could be that I am just hearing things from my algorithm that are reinforcing my preconceived notions. And if it's making me feel really, really, really bad, it's probably targeting my emotions, right? Emotional appeals are out there. So using that as a baseline. But then also, again, a simple thing. I hear oftentimes talking with groups, they say, well, the media, right, the journalists, learn to distinguish between the opinion page and the news page in a news organization, because both exist. And odds are the opinion page is going to make you feel one way or another, right? They're going to give you an emotional feeling. The news page might still do that, but it's going to be grounded in fact, it's going to be grounded in objectivity, and every good news organization has both. But we have lost the ability perhaps to distinguish, and sometimes those news organizations haven't helped by drawing that clear line. But we can do that work ourselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The media is such a catch-all. Could that be movies, Hollywood? Well, in some cases, could it be advertising? Well, some think that is. Could it be someone who has nothing to do with journalism? It can. So I always try to make the distinction. There are journalists, and then there's noise. So try to make that distinction. I don't know how your phone has been here the last few weeks with robocalls for politics.
For the last week.
See, you're a little younger, so you can say that. I'm looking out on folks who are saying, great, we got through all the election calls, now we're getting these damn Medicare calls. So I get it. But clearly, those calls are being funded by billions and billions of dollars in campaign contributions, and millions of those here in our state. Look at one of our state legislative races. I think when it's all said and done, there will be $4 million spent on a $57,000 a year job. Now, I don't know about you, that doesn't seem like a real good return on investment, but that's how it is this day and age. We know that some of those contributions are transparent. We see them on campaign disclosure documents. But a lot of them are what's called dark money, meaning the money comes in, but we don't know where it's from. Lee, is there anything that can help clean that up?
Well, there is. I don't want to make it sound simple, though, because based on the Supreme Court decision on our ability or inability to regulate campaign financing, it will require a constitutional amendment. But here's something that's happening right now. There are 22 states that have signed on to support a constitutional amendment, and they've done that by legislatively passing an advisory referendum statement that said that we should be able to regulate at the federal and state level campaign finance. And Wisconsin, it was in committee, it was at the table to pass the resolution last April. But it's an election year, and the clock is ticking, and they basically had Republicans and Democrats on board to pass that resolution, and it didn't get introduced, okay? We would have been the 23rd state. By the way, when you have a purple state like Wisconsin, if Wisconsin takes that position, that could be the door opener for other states. So, yeah, it's a journey to get 2/3 of the states to agree to something, but that's what's happened. That's why women can vote. That's why 18-year-olds can vote. All of those things started with a need, and it grew and became something that was approved. So that's likely to be reintroduced this coming year. And there were Republicans and Democrats supporting that. And if we give them our voice saying, hey, this is something's wrong here. We shouldn't be spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a federal election. We shouldn't be spending $12 billion on a congressional race and not know where the money is coming from and who's behind it. And we ought to be able to pass laws, common sense laws, to allow us to do that regulation. So I'm saying if this is introduced next year, I hope you're paying attention, and I hope you send our legislative representatives a note saying to do this. Now, if you pass a referendum, it's got to go to other states, and if you get 2/3 of the states to pass a referendum, then it goes to Congress, and they craft the language, and then it goes back to the states, and they have to ratify it. So it's a steep climb, but that's how things happened in the past. When we had the progressive era, and there were other pieces of significant constitutional legislation that was approved, that's how it went. And so we have to look at these problems and say, maybe things have to be bad enough to motivate us to take some steps to try to fix it. And I think that's where we are with campaign finance.
Yeah, I've given at least a dozen talks in the last 3 weeks to various groups about the election, and in just about every one, campaign finance came up in some way or another. We talked about it, of course, in our Rebuilding American Civics program. Just for some context for those of you who, because this is a confusing issue for some, but when the Supreme Court created the regime under Citizens United, that really removed the ability to statutorily deal with this. Congress could pass laws, but it would be very hard to pass a law that would pass muster constitutionally under Citizens United, hence the constitutional amendment process. And so it is imperative, I agree with Lee, that if folks really believe in this, and I hear from a lot of groups across the spectrum, people really, really want to see this change, then we need to push that process. And here's the thing, it is hard and it is time consuming, but I'll hark back to another aspect of living in a republic, which is that we are stewards of this democracy, meaning that we put in the hard work today that may not manifest for years, maybe not even decades. But that doesn't mean we don't put in the hard work today so that the process gets going. We have to think about this not in terms of what is the short-term fix that we can just do that will magically, get rid of the problem and make everything fine. We have to start working now. It is, again, it's like what I was talking earlier, messy, hard, long, dedicated work. But with that in mind, you can actually see something happen. Now, some of it, too, can be up to our own choice. If we demand different from our, say, media institutions, whatever those are, that can also have a way of influencing this. We're going to be put to the test here in Wisconsin in about 6 months. We have a Supreme Court election coming up in April. The last Supreme Court election we had in this state was the most expensive Supreme Court election we had in the state by a factor of, I don't even know, but it was a huge, huge factor over what we've seen in the past. This election likely will be even more because, once again, like the last one, the ideological balance of the court will be determined by this next election. It is a liberal justice who is stepping down, so it will then be a 3-3 court. So whoever gets elected will create the balance ideologically for the court. Unfortunately, in our state, we do this as partisan elections. I said unfortunately because I think judges should be nonpartisan positions. But we do it that way, and so we have to live with that. But what we saw in that last process, not just a lot of money, but I think the bulk of the money that came in was not even from Wisconsin residents. These were out-of-state actors who were trying to influence our in-state process. Now, I would think that we should have something to say about that, right? Now, there's not much we can do. We can't shut it down. But perhaps by saying we're not interested in that sort of advertising, telling our local media organizations perhaps don't, pay attention or as much attention to this, something has to be done because it is going to be a nasty, ugly, and it is the only thing at this point on the April ballot that is going to be consuming. So you better believe that will be big money spent.
Citizens United, let's recap for just a moment. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that businesses have the same rights as individuals to be heard, and that's why they can raise all sorts of money to pump into campaign contributions. Now, you do know the trivia question about that justice who is retiring. You know she used to teach in La Crosse. Ann Walsh Bradley used to be a teacher at Aquinas. Just so you know.
So it always comes back to Western Wisconsin.
There's always, I'm a journalist, there's always a local angle. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but you also have note cards as you're thinking of questions that you would like asked. Mike Dernan, who does a great job as one of our board members, will be glad to collect what I would suggest. Write your question, pass it this direction, and then Mike can collect, bring up, and we'll try to tackle those. So we want you to get your questions answered as much as possible. So let's talk about one reform measure that Lee has been intimately involved with, and our leader ethics group has hosted multiple forums on, and that is what's called Final Five voting. So I'll ask Lee to explain what Final Five voting is, talk a little about how it fared last week in elections across the country, a bit of foreshadowing, not well. But also take a look at where it stands in Wisconsin. So, Lee, could you give us an idea about Final Five voting?
Sure. I believe this is an electoral reform that's worth getting behind because it gets at one of the core problems that we have. Now, keep in mind, we have layers of problems if we want to try to address the Democratic. So this isn't going to fix all the layers, but it's going to deal with one of them, and that's where due to our hyper-partisanship, we can primary someone who dares to cross the aisle. All right? That's a significant problem when you're as divided as you are. And it even has a campaign finance issue to it because if you're in Congress, you're going to spend a lot of time at a phone bank calling people to raise money, and you're not working on the issues. But the other thing is, there are the most hyper-extreme candidates. That's their strategy to raise money, is they make bold statements, outrageous statements, and they get small dollar donors that they send checks like you wouldn't believe. And so the problem gets even worse because it's tied to the campaign finance pressure that people have. Okay, so there's a piece of legislation that's being introduced in Wisconsin, and it's called Final Five voting. It's a two-part piece of legislation. The first part is that it says that you have an open primary, so you can have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and an independent running, and you could have 10 candidates running. The top 5 go to the general election. And in Wisconsin, they're only focusing on the federal positions, House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. So it's not even narrow, it's not even affecting all the other positions. I personally think it would be good for all of them, but they're just trying to take a single step. But that's such an important thing because when you have that hyper-partisanship, the 20% of the people that vote in the primary are basically making the decisions who our elected representatives are, not the general population. That's what happened to Mike Gallagher. So the first step is you basically say, yeah, you can primary somebody if you don't like them, but if they did a decent job and they make it to the top 5, it's going to go to the full population. Then the second part of that is they use a instant runoff process. Some people call it ranked choice voting. But the idea is, of the 5, how do you sort out who has a majority of support so that you don't have somebody with 21% of the vote being elected in a general election, and we all think that that's a good thing. So you have a process to do that. And some states do other runoffs. They basically, they'll take the top 2 and then they have a second general election. So it's done in other states, and that can work. It's very expensive though, especially the way our elections are running. So that's the reason why it's being introduced as a single package. There are a significant number of Republicans and Democrats that have signed on to that bill. It's had 2 hearings last year. Again, it wasn't introduced for a vote, and an election year that's probably understandable, very understandable. But it will likely be introduced again, and if you have that strong bipartisan support, we should get behind that. We should get behind it. Now, I have to tell you, I was very discouraged to see what happened nationally. There were 6 states that had a ballot issue on Final 4 or Final 5 voting. It's basically the same thing. 5 of the 6 voted it down. One of them, Nevada, their constitution says you have to approve it twice. So they approved it the first time, and the second time they didn't approve it. The one that's really discouraging, it's not official yet because only 76% of the people in Alaska they've tallied, so there still could be some, and it's fairly close. But Alaska actually adopted this. They adopted it, and they used it in 2020, and they elected a conservative Republican governor, a Democratic congressman, a Congress representative, and this last year, in their budget development process, they had the best collaboration they've had ever. And then if you go online and you just ask about the opinion pages and so on, their analysis, they basically formed a bipartisan budget committee to figure out the budget. They didn't throw stuff back and forth. But there was a group that didn't like it. And if that group wins in this ballot, it's going to be removed from the federal positions. It's a setback. If something is working is going potentially a setback. But I wouldn't be discouraged about that in terms of Wisconsin. I think if we do that, that's a good thing. It's a good step in the right direction. And it also lets the population know we've got to take some steps to try to counter this divisiveness that we have. We have to. It will not get better by itself. It won't.
And one of the reasons I think for hope, I was listening to a couple of retired state legislators, one Democrat, one Republican, is if you look at the results statewide in Wisconsin this time, we actually had a pretty interesting shift. in that our two deliberative bodies, our state Senate and our state Assembly, actually are more aligned with the way that people vote in this state for some time. And so what both the retired Republican and the retired Democrat were pointing out is that there is now incentive for both sides to work together that had not existed for some time. That both sides see the path forward of wanting to collaborate, wanting to get things done, and wanting to work together. So that's promising.
So I'm going to try to combine some of your questions here, so bear with me. How do we combat the divisiveness based on whether people are getting all of their news from Fox, CNN, NBC, MSNBC, and we talked about sources of information that are more reliable or trusted. Help us understand where those are. So do you want to start first with going home and tuning into the station that you believe in most, and how do you get a full spectrum of information, and where are some good sources?
Yeah, so, I know I'm probably speaking against some folks of diet proponents these days, but you know, the best diet is a healthy, balanced diet, right? You want to have some meat, you want to have some vegetables, you want to have some things that are treats. I look at news consumption the same way. I'm an omnivore. And so it means that I want to get information from a variety of sources. I want to look at what maybe the folks on the right are listening to. I want to look at what people on the left are looking at. I also then want to find things that are just news-driven organizations. And we're lucky enough to have that with Reuters and the Associated Press as a great example. Those are, that's the Joe Friday news sources, right? Just the facts, ma'am, nothing else. There's no opinion buried in there. I also love to pull some information from foreign sources, BBC, The Economist, because they have an objective take on what we're doing. They have no skin in the game, and they're just writing as they're seeing it but from an outsider perspective. So part of it is, again, getting out of your comfort zone and being willing to hear things that might challenge your preconceived notions. And I know that's a lot to ask of people, but it is necessary. One of the things I'm constantly asking my classes is, how much time are you spending each week with people or ideas that don't conform to your idea of the world? Because if all you're doing is hearing things that make you feel affirmed and better all the time, you're really not scratching that intellectual itch that you need to be doing. You have to understand that there is a whole segment of the world that perhaps is not just seeing things differently, might not even be hearing the same stories. We saw that in this cycle. They did a study looking at MSNBC and Fox, and we're finding that people who just watch those news sources were not hearing news stories that the other side had heard. That's problematic. So MSNBC and Fox are not going to change their model. They're both doing fine with their model. They're making money with their model. And so it puts, again, the onus, unfortunately, but I think importantly, on our shoulders, that we have to be willing to do the work. So spend time with ideas that are challenging to you. Spend time with ideas that are difficult. Have those conversations with people who maybe think differently, but try to form those respectful conversations in doing it. I think that's the only way that this happens, because it's not going to happen from the top down. It has to happen from the citizen's perspective.
You mentioned news sources. Are there any you would suggest, Lee?
Yes, actually, Sam is so right. We consume our media in silos. And so it's so much harder for us when that's all we're seeing to respect the different perspectives that people have. You can go to a site called All Sides, and All Sides will give you, they'll tell you the most liberal, the most moderate liberal, middle of the road, more conservative, very conservative sites. And you can look at something that you're reading or seeing, and you can say, I see where they're coming from. Okay? I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but now I have a sense on that. But it's a good way to look at trying to get out of the silo. There's a couple of sites I like. There's one's called Flipside and another one called Tangle. And what they'll do is they'll take the top story of the day, and they will give you different stories from both sides. So you're covering one story from multiple sides. It's kind of like a 3D view. But that's a good way to understand what different people are thinking. People who think differently than I do, perhaps, but they're thinking with maybe very, very good legitimate reasons. And so it gives us a better opportunity to be respectful for the differences that we have.
We've used the word civility a couple times, and you've obviously picked up on that with the questions I've received. So here are a couple involving civility. Where is the civility in all the negative print and TV ads? Where's the civility?
It's not there. I've looked, I've peeked, but it's simply not there. These ads, and it just felt like this cycle especially, it felt like maybe there was one positive ad for maybe every 20 negative ads. And we just continue to go down that path, unfortunately, which is unfortunate because what political science at least shows us is that these negative ads tend not to change minds. It's not like you're watching the news and you're supporting one candidate and you see a negative ad and say, oh, you know what, I'm not supporting them anymore, I'm going to go support the other side. But what they do, and this speaks to the whole issue of civility and also getting out of the silo, is it reinforces the negative partisanship that is out there right now. This idea that not only do I believe what I believe, but the other side is my existential enemy, that they are going to ruin the country. And this was a narrative that we heard this election. Both sides were claiming if the other side won, it was going to be the end of America. Not if the other side won, they're going to pass policies that we don't like. Not if the other side won, they're going to maybe do some things that we'll have to just live with for some period of time until the winds change. That it would be the end of America. When you're faced with that sort of choice and that sort of information, it is really hard, especially if you're not, again, forcing yourself to pull out of that and look for good information, to just believe that, to start believing that about the other side. Which is, again, why we have to take that active role to get out there, to come to sessions like this, because I just knowing the Rebuilding American Civics group I know that's out there right now, we have diversity of opinion out there. This is great. We bring people together in common cause who are across the political spectrum, who want to share, who want to learn together. Well, we have to seek out those opportunities. But yeah, those negative ads are horrendous. And there's, again, without censorship, there's no magic bullet to do it. So this is the challenge. All this stuff keeps coming down on our shoulders. But that's why Ben Franklin said it's a republic if you keep it. He didn't say it's a republic if the government decides to keep it. It's a republic if we decide to keep it, which means that we have to do the work, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Have you been dismayed by the lack of civility?
Yes, very much so, because that is a danger. It is a danger that if incidents happen, they can escalate. And then once that escalation gets going, then it's very difficult to bring it back down again. We have to realize that in the 1990s, maybe 20% of the ads were negative. Mm-hmm. And it's completely flipped. Now, by far the minority are the feel-good ads. And the fastest growing source of news media is social media. And for the Gen Z, that's probably the primary, if not only source. And the interesting thing is there's a study that said that the Gen Z is processing social media. They look at the headline and they skip the story and they go to the comments. And so there's just some things here that are concerning. But here's where the change has to occur, in local communities. Mm-hmm. All right, because you can't try to turn this ship around on these dynamics at the national level. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult at the state level. But here, we're talking about neighbors. We're talking about people that we know or do business with, and if we can get a better understanding here, communities can be models for other communities, and we can start to have some impact. And so I hope we can keep civility front and center.
Yeah, and I think there was actually proof positive of this in this campaign cycle. because if we demand ethical leadership, it might actually manifest. In one of the local races, there was a real harsh negative ad that was run against one of the opponent's candidates, but it was run by an outside group. That candidate actually took to social media and pointed out that he did not approve that ad, and he basically said, I would not have allowed that ad to happen were I consulted. So this is what we need, is we also need our leaders to step up when these outside groups run ads, because by definition, these outside groups cannot run in coordination with the candidates. So this means that oftentimes the stuff that's coming out might or might not even be known to that candidate's campaign. So we need the candidates then to, like had it happen here, to step up if something like that happened and say, look, I disagree with that. It's still the ad's gonna run, but I as a candidate do not abide by that sort of behavior. And that, again, is much easier to run on the local level.
So I'm going to give you a little different spin on that, and then I'll answer the next question because I might have a different spin on that too. The question was negative print and TV ads. We all saw the TV ads. The print ads you may have seen coming to your home in flyers, but did you see any in the newspaper? Why is that? And it's not just because newspapers have lost some print audience in favor of digital. This has been a trend for years and years. Why is that? Broadcast has to run these commercials. They are bound by law to run these commercials. Newspapers? No. Let me give you an example. I used to be an editor in Ottumwa, Iowa. That is home, yes, to Radar O'Reilly, but also to the actor Tom Arnold, who at the time was married to another Hollywood star, a fairly loud one. And Tom came into my office the day before an election, and he throws his money clip on my desk. And it was a lot fatter than this one, just so you know, and said, I want to pay for an ad to run on election day, tomorrow. And here's what it's going to say, all sorts of things about this candidate I don't like. And I said, thank you very much. We are in the business of making money, but we're also in the business of being fair as journalists. You're making allegations in this ad that I will not accept, because I can't prove them, you can't prove them, and we do not give the candidate enough time before the election, since you're running it on election day, to disprove or to have any comment. But here's my money clip. I said, I took the paper and did this back. I didn't even want to touch it. I said, here, take your money clip. Your money doesn't work here, not when it comes to that. So newspapers do have some discretion. And I can assure you, I've used it at the La Crosse Tribune as well as publisher. And as editor, I've had ad reps come over and say, can we run this? No, you can't say this, and this, because we don't know that it's true. So newspapers indeed have some discretion. Now, there are other dynamics that are at play that mean we're not running campaign ads because people aren't trying to buy them like they are with TV. But TV has very little discretion. In fact, I saw a disclaimer this cycle from a TV station saying, we don't necessarily approve of this, but we got to run it. Well, you know, that's kind of icky. And yeah, I don't like the censorship word either. But I also like a little judgment, discernment, using, again, that BS detector, if you will, that I talked about earlier, that Hemingway referred to.
Yeah, that was and I'm sure several of you saw, there was a rather graphic ad that ran this cycle And that is not, by the way, a First Amendment issue. This is an FEC, Federal Elections Commission, and FCC, Federal
right.
Communications
Yes.
Commission, sorry, not FEC, FCC issue, FCC regulation. So it has nothing to do really with First Amendment. First Amendment is kind of lurking there in the background, but this is an FCC issue that applies with the television piece. So, we're sometimes just kind of stuck, unfortunately.
And that even goes to what's called the equal time doctrine, where one candidate happened to be on Saturday Night Live the Saturday night before the election, and the other squawked and all of a sudden was in a pit crew in NASCAR, which I don't know. Okay. Now, here's a question that I'm not going to defer, I'm going to answer. And you may not like the answer, but I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell you why. How do you feel about news sources like newspapers endorsing candidates? It seems to be a finger on the scales. It's a really good question. And more newspapers are not endorsing. Our local paper doesn't endorse. We know the last time the Washington Post and the LA Times did not endorse the presidential candidate. I think there are good reasons to endorse. And let me tell you the whole process as I'm trying to justify this. A school referendum. Well, I think it's important that you know what side on an editorial page a newspaper may be taking on something like this. Sometimes we are in favor, sometimes we are opposed. The huge referendum involving the high schools in La Crosse a couple of years ago, when the newspaper was still endorsing, said thanks but no. Let me talk about process first of all. We would have every candidate in, and that would mean a local candidate, a candidate for statewide office, a candidate for U.S. Senate. We would have those candidates into our office and ask them questions, tough questions, and we'd ask the same questions of each side. And then we would make decisions. Now, keep in mind, the Tribune had, and at several papers I've worked at, we have developed what we call a citizens editorial board. So we have members of the community who are part of this process, who chip in with their own questions, who give their own advice. Excuse me, I think that's healthy. I also think, and let me just tell you a couple of experiences. Someone was running for a city council in Davenport, Iowa, and they were having real budget problems. Well, how would you cut the budget responsibly? Well, I would like to cut by nutrition. I'm sorry, how would you? Well, I'd like to do it by nutrition. And I'm thinking to myself, you can starve people and that way you get them off the budget, or what the heck? I didn't get it. There are times that you can tell pretty quickly, is this someone I trust to make good judgments, or is it not? Things that don't show up in campaign flyers may not show up in community forums, but things that we know. We also know, how is that person's staff? How good are they at responding to inquiries that all of you may have about a Medicare check, about a zoning issue, about, believe me, we hear all the time, oh, I called that office and they blew me off. Or, boy, I called that office and they took it seriously and they really worked hard to get an answer for me. And even to introduce legislation to change and fix a problem. That's what, to me, that's not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's an issue of being an elected official who serves others. I think that is one of those intangibles that we often use when we endorse candidates. I think it's too bad when newspapers are, I will say, cowering from that responsibility. And keep in mind, newspapers have been endorsing candidates for decades. Had a candidate once walk in and he said the person he was running against didn't even have a college degree. Well, I'm looking at I know exactly where it was from and what year. And I said, I'm sorry, you're wrong. The next thing out of this person's mouth was, well, it's a shame that our university can't retain students. Do you know it's 87%, one of the top public universities of our size in the country? I literally walked over to my speakerphone, put it on speaker, called the person who was chancellor at the time and said, what is the 87%? That's really good. Oh yeah, it's second highest in the state of Wisconsin, and we're the envy of many other universities. So again, sometimes people would come in with their own talking points that were just not rooted in reality. Well, I'm not going to endorse that person. Now keep one other thing in mind. If you thought you were tired of political ads on TV, you were probably tired of some of the letters of the editor. I get it, and some of the same voices over and over. But you know, that page, there's a really big word on the top of that page, opinion. So why, as part of an informed electorate, would we as a newspaper allow all sorts of people to have their opinion? And let me tell you, a lot of it is boilerplate stuff that's handed to them from campaigns. And yet we're interviewing candidates, we're doing our homework. Why wouldn't we get our chance to have an opinion too? I would argue that it's healthier that we do. And we always wrote a preamble saying, you may agree, you may disagree. That's not the point. We want you to vote. We want you to vote. But we think it's our responsibility, after talking to all these candidates, to give you what our opinion is. And I think that's a good thing. I also know there are people who, especially when we go the other direction, think you guys are out of touch. Well, fine. You get your say on election day, and that's the way it ought to be. So anyway, that was the one that I wanted to answer.
Yeah, and just one other thing on this too, because one of the things I found that was disturbing, and I'd be curious to think what you think on this, particularly when one newspaper decided not to endorse, about 200,000 people canceled their subscription to that newspaper. To me, that's really troublesome, because to cancel your newspaper because you're either not getting an endorsement or someone writes an op-ed that you don't care for, you're basically removing the funding from the news organization, from the journalism that is being done by that news organization. And right now, in my opinion, we need good journalism more than ever. Journalism and journalists are the ones who go out there, they get the stories, they ask the tough questions, they provide necessary transparency often for our political process. And so I think sometimes a response like that is a little bit of cutting off your nose to maybe spite your face.
And there were two newspapers, the Washington Post and the LA Times. And I thought it was too bad, but again.
And especially the Post the day before collected, I think it was 2 Pulitzer Prizes for investigative journalism the day before that happened. You don't want to quash that fire.
I don't think you should.
No.
Okay, so I'm going to combine a couple more questions. How do you lower the price of eggs? And did grocery store prices, sexism, and racism determine the result of the election? Is critical thinking a luxury when people are just trying to survive?
So the past week, as you can imagine, if you read across a wide variety of news sources, there have been multiple explanations for the results of the election. I think that in looking back, this election is incredibly complicated. We do not know. All we have at this point is exit poll data, which is not great. I mean, it's something, but it is. This will be continued to be refined over the next several months. We have a bunch of pundits who are writing their opinions. These are many times the same pundits who were saying something about how the election was going to go that didn't play out. So, you know, take all that with a grain of salt. And so I don't want to boil down the causes for any result down to, well, it was this factor or this factor or this. I think for a lot of groups it was it was many factors that factored in. And I think if you put 100 people in the room, you might get 75 different responses as to why people voted the way they did. Humans are complicated critters. That said, I really do appreciate the second part of the question, the whole point of, is critical thinking too much to ask when people are just trying to survive? And I get that. I understand that people are hurting out there today, that this economy has taken a toll on lots of people. But unfortunately, citizenship is not one of those things that you just exercise in the best of times. Citizenship is something that we have to constantly be exercising. And it does mean perhaps, again, even in more difficult times, to be willing and to take the time to put that effort in. I get it that there are people working 2 or 3 jobs. Finding the time for that is very difficult. And I don't have an easy answer. I can't just say, and so therefore, just do this. But I also am not going to be, I'm not willing to just absolve people of that responsibility, because it is serious, and you shouldn't just vote because you have no information. Part of again, this whole idea of being in a republic is you make a choice based on information that you gather. You put that process in. I am going to use a bad word here. There was a great documentary, and I talked about this with our civics group a few weeks back. There was a documentary called Join or Die. I don't know if any of you saw this. Viterbo did a showing this summer. It's all about joining organizations that in our communities that help bolster democracy. And at one point, a woman in the documentary pointed out, she said, democracy is hard work, and sometimes it's real shitty work, right? It is not always rewarding. Sometimes it is a real slog, but unfortunately, we have to be willing to do it. Now, those of us who have the capacity, the ability, the luxury to put the thought in, well, we need to make sure that we're doing that, because we have to recognize that not everybody does have that ability, but we should also be doing our best to find and bolster up those communities and getting information out there. It's not an easy task, but I just think it's essential.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm respectful of your time, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to combine a couple more into one question, but then I'm sure panelists would stick around if you have any questions that I did not get to. And it's a little bit of a similar vein, but let me combine these. One is from a really good community volunteer. Works in all sorts of good agencies, points out I'm required to go through security and background checks. Why aren't public officials required to do that, especially when our new president is a felon? The other question I'll roll into that is, we talk about civility, and we pointed out our 4 pillars. So do our winning candidates all support those sorts of pillars and how they respond? I'm seeing heads shaking here. So the bottom line question to both is, well, what can we do to change that? What can we do to change that?
Well, I do think there's one thing that I want to point out, and that is we talked about how media and social media can cloud things. Of course, the ads are designed to cloud things. But, there are some tools that can help us as citizens to better understand who the candidates are locally. If you have a chance to go to a forum and they give audience questions, that could be helpful, because you get the stump speech first, but now you would get at least a sense of how they would respond to the Q&A part. Debates. And I'm not talking about the national debates, I'm talking about the debates for Congress and state assembly and state senate and so on and so on. Because that's where you can go and you can see and hear and observe and learn. And right now, there's a lot of candidates where the campaigns just say, whatever their excuse is, they're finding ways to not do that. And we as citizens should be calling that out. Because that'll give us a lot more insight on who the person really is, if you can go to a place and you can see and observe that.
I have more than a little experience with that particular topic, and I know there are groups like League of Women Voters that does not agree, but one way to fix that is what we call the empty chair debate, and I've done that before. You put the nameplate of the person right here on the table, and you have this empty chair right here, and the other candidate over here. And I have simply gone to candidates and I've said, it's your choice. But if you think you're going to shut down this debate, we've had media partnerships in this area for more than 25 years, hosting debates for candidates. And I know a couple of times I've had to go to people, frankly, in at least one case, someone I'm very fond of. And I've said, here's the deal. I know you don't really want to do this right now, and I'm sorry you don't, but we're forging ahead. And your name's going to be right here, and your chair's going to be right here, and if you choose to fill it, I think you should, but that's your decision. But you are not going to prevent us from talking to the other candidate. It's your call. And when you, frankly, play hardball, it's pretty interesting how often they say, all right, I guess I'll come. But I think that is an example of us insisting. We're talking about electing people to represent us. They can't come to a group like this and have a discussion. Boy, that signals a bad problem as far as I'm concerned. And more you're seeing that. And I think there are ways of fixing it. You just have to be a little ornery, I guess, which I qualify for. Thank you for the wonderful questions. Thank you for being with us, showing an interest. And as Sam said, this isn't just a once every 2 year, once every 4 year sort of exercise. Democracy is messy, it's hard work, and it's something that I think we all need to be vigilant about. I know all of you are, but I think it's important to stay involved, to keep track of what our elected officials are doing, and hold them accountable as we all should. Sam, any final words?
No, just keep doing the good work of citizenship. You all, by coming to forums like this are doing that sort of work. It only works if we are all doing our part. And I really appreciate Rusty and Lee joining us today. This was just a wonderful conversation, and as Rusty said, we'll stick around here for a little bit because we know some of you might need to go, but we are here if you want to ask other questions. Be happy to do that.
Thank you again.
Thanks.